The plane was preparing for takeoff when an outraged female voice echoed through the cabin. All eyes turned to a slender blonde woman in a designer dress, standing by her seat and loudly demanding to speak with the crew. "This is unacceptable," she shouted, gesturing emphatically. The passengers stared in confusion until she added, "How can I trust my life to that pilot?" The passengers exchanged bewildered looks as she delivered the shocking statement, "I won't board this plane if the pilot is black." At that moment, the atmosphere in the cabin grew so tense it felt like you could hear everyone's heart stop. But what happened next was something no one expected. What do you think happened afterward? Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to find out the rest of the story. The cabin hummed with the usual pre-flight activity, flight attendants walking briskly down the aisle, passengers adjusting their seats, and overhead compartments clicking shut. The soft murmur of conversations mixed with the low hum of the engines as everyone settled in for the journey ahead. Amid this calm, a voice suddenly rose above the noise, sharp and agitated. It came from the middle rows, where a blonde woman in a designer dress stood, her expression taut with displeasure. Her voice, though unclear, carried a tone of insistence that immediately drew the attention of those around her. "Excuse me. Excuse me," she called out, waving her hand as though summoning a waiter at a restaurant. Several heads turned toward her, passengers exchanging confused glances. The woman, her perfectly coiffed hair gleaming under the cabin lights, didn't seem to notice or care about the stares. "What's the problem now?" whispered a man in the seat behind her, leaning slightly toward his seatmate. "Maybe her seat doesn't recline," the other replied with a shrug. But as her tone grew sharper, it became clear that this wasn't a minor inconvenience. Her words were becoming louder, though still fragmented. "Unacceptable, need to speak, can't fly like this," she said, her voice trembling with indignation. The murmurs among passengers began to spread. People craned their necks to get a better look, curious and a little wary of what was unfolding. One elderly woman clutched her handbag a little tighter, while a child across the aisle leaned toward the window, trying to avoid the commotion. A flight attendant approached the woman, her professional smile firmly in place. "Ma'am, is there something I can assist you with?" she asked, her tone calm but purposeful. "Yes, there is," the blonde woman snapped, turning to the attendant with a dramatic wave of her hand. "I need to speak with someone in charge." "Now." The attendant maintained her composure. "I'm here to help. Could you please explain the issue?" "It's not something I want to discuss here," the woman said, casting a meaningful glance around the cabin. "This is private, but it's urgent." Passengers were now fully engaged, their earlier conversations forgotten. The air felt charged, as though the woman's agitation had sent an electric current through the cabin. In the front row, a businessman lowered his newspaper, his brow furrowed. In the back, a mother hushed her curious child, her eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. The attendant tried again, her voice gentle but firm. "Ma'am, if you could clarify your concern, we'd be happy to address it before takeoff." The woman huffed, glancing toward the front of the plane. "I need to know. I need to know who's flying this plane," she finally said, her words clipped and precise. The attendant's polite smile faltered for the briefest moment before she recovered. "Our pilot is highly experienced and fully qualified, ma'am," she assured her. "There's nothing to worry about." The blonde woman crossed her arms, her lips pressed into a thin line. "That's not what I'm asking," she said sharply. "I need to see the pilot." A ripple of confusion swept through the cabin. Passengers exchanged incredulous glances, their curiosity now tinged with unease. Why would she demand to see the pilot? What was she implying? As the woman's demands grew louder, the cabin's atmosphere shifted from mere curiosity to something heavier. People began to sense that whatever was bothering her wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. There was something deeper at play, though no one could yet put a finger on it. And as the flight attendant promised to speak with her supervisor, the blonde woman sat back down, her expression simmering with frustration. Whatever her issue was, it wasn't going away quietly. The tension in the air was palpable, leaving everyone wondering what, exactly, was about to unfold. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the flight crew prepared for takeoff, but the rising voice of the blonde woman quickly shattered the momentary calm. She stood up abruptly, her movements sharp and deliberate, commanding attention with the kind of authority that demanded people stop what they were doing and listen. Her designer dress hugged her figure perfectly, her blonde hair immaculate, but her expression was anything but composed. "I need to speak to someone in charge," she declared, her voice firm, carrying through the cabin with an edge of urgency. She clutched the back of the seat in front of her, her knuckles turning white. "My safety is at risk, and I refuse to ignore it." The passengers, already confused by her earlier outburst, now turned their full attention to her. Conversations halted, and a ripple of unease swept through the cabin. Some looked at her with concern, others with irritation, wondering what could possibly be so dire before the plane even left the ground. "What is she going on about now?" a man in business attire muttered, shaking his head. Across the aisle, a young couple leaned toward each other, whispering as their eyes darted between the woman and the flight crew. One of the flight attendants approached her, maintaining a calm demeanor despite the rising tension. "Ma'am, please take your seat. We're preparing for takeoff, and all passengers must remain seated." But the woman refused to budge. "I will not sit down until I'm assured of my safety," she said, her voice unwavering. "Do you understand the liability here? Do you?" Her words, delivered with a sense of entitlement, hung heavy in the air. The flight attendant tried again, her tone patient but firm. "Ma'am, I assure you that the safety of all passengers is our top priority. If you have a specific concern, I'd be happy to address it." "I do have a concern," the woman snapped, her eyes narrowing. "And it's about who is flying this plane." Gasps rippled through the cabin. A child in the back asked loudly, "What's wrong with the pilot, Mommy?" prompting shushing noises from several rows. "Ma'am," the attendant began, her professionalism strained but intact, "our pilot is highly trained and has years of experience. I assure you, you're in good hands." But the blonde woman wasn't satisfied. "I want to speak with the pilot directly," she demanded. "I have the right to know who's responsible for my life and the lives of everyone on this plane." The atmosphere in the cabin shifted. Whispers spread among the passengers like wildfire, each trying to make sense of what was happening. "Does she think something's wrong with the pilot?" one man speculated. "Or is this just some kind of power trip?" another woman murmured, her expression a mix of annoyance and curiosity. Some passengers began to grow visibly irritated. "She's holding us up," a young woman in a window seat muttered. "We're going to miss our connection because of her drama." Others, however, watched with growing concern. What was this woman really implying? Did she know something they didn't? Was there a genuine safety issue? The uncertainty gnawed at the edges of their nerves. The blonde woman took another step forward, her presence now fully commanding the aisle. "If the airline values its passengers, it will address my concerns immediately," she said, her tone icy. The flight attendant hesitated for a moment, clearly weighing her options. She nodded toward a colleague, who quickly made her way to the front of the plane, likely to consult with the captain. The woman crossed her arms, her chin raised, as though she had already won some unspoken battle. As the minutes ticked by, the cabin grew more restless. Passengers shifted in their seats, the earlier hum of excitement replaced with palpable tension. Whatever the blonde woman's intentions, she had become the undeniable center of attention, the eye of a storm she seemed determined to control. And yet, her true motivation, what had driven her to disrupt the flight so brazenly, remained a mystery to everyone, heightening the unease that now filled the air. Whatever came next, it was clear that this conflict was far from over. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder as the blonde woman, now visibly agitated, stood by her seat. Her frustration had escalated from vague complaints to outright demands, drawing more and more attention from the passengers around her. The flight attendants had tried to calm her, their professional smiles masking their growing impatience, but nothing seemed to work. She waved her hands dramatically, her voice rising above the low hum of the plane. "This isn't about comfort," she declared, her sharp tones slicing through the air. "It's about safety. My safety. Everyone's safety." Passengers exchanged puzzled glances. What could she possibly mean? The plane hadn't even left the ground, and no one else had noticed anything unusual. The flight attendants continued to coax her back to her seat, but she crossed her arms, standing firm. "I have every right to know who's in charge of this flight," she said, her voice dripping with entitlement. "And I demand to speak to the pilot." There was a collective intake of breath among the passengers. The request was unusual, and the tension in the cabin thickened. A man seated nearby shook his head, muttering under his breath, "What does it matter who's flying the plane? They're obviously qualified." The flight attendant closest to her maintained a calm demeanor, though the strain in her voice was evident. "Ma'am, I assure you that our pilot is experienced and fully certified. There's absolutely no reason to be concerned." But the woman wasn't satisfied. She glanced around the cabin, as if searching for allies among the passengers, and then leaned in closer to the flight attendant, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Unfortunately for her, those seated nearby could still hear her words clearly. "I saw him," she hissed. "I saw him in the cockpit when I boarded. He's black." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. The passengers who heard her went rigid, their expressions shifting from confusion to shock and disgust. A heavy silence fell over the cabin as the full weight of her statement sank in. For a moment, it seemed like no one could believe what they'd just heard. "Excuse me," the flight attendant said, her voice sharp for the first time. Her professionalism faltered, replaced by disbelief. "You heard me," the woman said, raising her chin defiantly. "I'm not putting my life in the hands of someone like that. This is about safety, and I have every right to refuse." A murmur of outrage spread through the cabin, growing louder with each passing second. Passengers turned to one another, whispering furiously. Did she really just say that? What century is she living in? Unbelievable. A young woman sitting a few rows behind the blonde spoke up, her voice trembling with anger. "Are you serious right now? You're making a scene because the pilot is black? Do you even hear yourself?" The blonde woman spun around, her eyes narrowing. "I'm not racist," she snapped. "I just think it's important to have the most qualified person flying the plane." "And you think his skin color determines that?" Another passenger shot back, their tone laced with disgust. "You're ridiculous." The blonde woman's face flushed, but she didn't back down. "You can't tell me I don't have the right to be concerned about my safety." At this point, the murmurs had turned into outright indignation. People were raising their voices, some demanding she sit down, others calling for the flight attendants to intervene more forcefully. The blonde woman stood her ground, though her confidence seemed to waver as she realized she was rapidly losing the crowd. The flight attendant, her professionalism now replaced with a quiet firmness, stepped closer. "Ma'am, I need to make it very clear, our pilot is one of the most experienced professionals in the industry. His qualifications are beyond question, and your concerns are entirely unfounded." But the woman shook her head stubbornly. "I'm not comfortable," she insisted. "I don't care what anyone says." By now, the passengers were fully united against her. Voices rose in solidarity, condemning her ignorance and bigotry. "If you're so uncomfortable," one man called out, "why don't you get off the plane?" The blonde woman turned bright red, her defiance crumbling under the weight of collective outrage. She glanced around, realizing that no one supported her, that she was completely alone in her prejudice. And yet, her whispered words, those few hateful sentences, had already left an indelible mark on everyone in that cabin. It wasn't just her blatant racism that had stunned them. It was the reminder that such attitudes, outdated and hateful, still existed in a world that should have long moved past them. The atmosphere in the plane had shifted entirely, and the woman, whether she knew it or not, had exposed a darkness that the passengers were now determined to confront. The cabin was thick with tension as the murmurs of shocked passengers filled the air. The blonde woman, still standing defiantly in the aisle, looked from face to face, searching for some semblance of support among the crowd. She found none. Her previous confidence had started to falter, but her stubbornness remained unshaken. At that moment, a member of the flight crew stepped forward, a tall, composed woman with a badge identifying her as the head flight attendant. Her uniform was immaculate, her posture straight, and her expression unreadable. Her calm presence cut through the chaos like a knife, drawing everyone's attention. "Ma'am," she began, her voice steady and measured, "I understand you have concerns, and I'm here to address them. However, I must remind you that our pilot is a highly trained professional with years of experience. The safety of our passengers is, and always has been, our highest priority." The blonde woman crossed her arms, her face still flushed from the backlash she had faced moments ago. "You're missing the point," she snapped. "This isn't about training, it's about judgment. And I don't feel comfortable trusting someone like that with my life." The flight attendant's composure didn't waver. She clasped her hands in front of her, her gaze steady. "Ma'am, I need to be clear, your discomfort does not reflect the reality of our pilot's capabilities. If you're unable to trust the crew we've assigned to this flight, you are welcome to disembark and find alternate travel arrangements." A ripple of approval swept through the cabin. Passengers nodded, some whispering words of agreement, others shooting satisfied glances at the blonde woman. For the first time, she looked genuinely unsettled, her eyes darting around as though seeking an escape. "That's not fair," she exclaimed, her voice rising. "I have a right to be here just like everyone else." The flight attendant didn't flinch. "You absolutely do," she replied, her tone unwavering. "But so does our pilot, who has earned his position through hard work and dedication. If your concerns are rooted in personal prejudice, I'm afraid that is not something we can accommodate." The blonde woman's mouth opened and closed as though she were grasping for a retort, but no words came. The firmness of the crew's response had shifted the balance of power in the cabin. What had initially been her stage, a moment to air her indignation, was now fully under the crew's control. Another member of the flight crew approached, this time a male flight attendant who stood beside his colleague, reinforcing her stance. "Ma'am," he said gently, "we understand this situation has caused some distress, but the safety and professionalism of this crew are not up for debate. If you'd like to discuss your concerns further, we can arrange for you to speak with ground staff once the plane has landed." The passengers erupted into murmurs again, this time tinged with a sense of justice. It was clear to everyone that the crew was not going to tolerate behavior that disrupted the flight or disrespected their team. The blonde woman, now visibly flustered, looked around once more, her confidence all but gone. The head flight attendant took one last step forward. Her voice softened slightly, but her words remained firm. "Ma'am, this flight cannot proceed with unnecessary disruptions." If you choose to stay, I must ask that you comply with our policies and respect the decisions of the crew. Otherwise, we will have no choice but to ask you to leave the aircraft." The weight of the ultimatum hung in the air. The blonde woman seemed to shrink slightly, her bravado crumbling under the pressure of the crew's calm authority and the disapproving eyes of the other passengers. For a moment, it looked as though she might continue to argue, but then she slumped back into her seat, her lips pressed into a thin line. The flight attendant nodded once, her expression neutral, before turning to address the rest of the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. Thank you for your patience and understanding as we work to ensure a safe and comfortable flight for everyone." The passengers clapped, their applause a clear endorsement of the crew's handling of the situation. The blonde woman sat stiffly in her seat, her face pale, as the tension in the cabin began to dissipate. The crew's response had not only de-escalated the conflict but also reinforced a powerful message: prejudice had no place here. The cabin felt like a pressure cooker, the tension thick enough to touch. The blonde woman stood rigid in the aisle, her face a mask of indignation as her demands continued to hang in the air. Around her, passengers exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of disbelief, anger, and quiet determination. The murmurs had grown louder, rippling through the rows like an unstoppable tide. At first, no one dared to openly challenge her. The initial shock of her words still lingered, leaving many frozen in place, unsure of how to respond. But as the seconds ticked by, something shifted. A man seated a few rows behind her slowly stood, adjusting his tie and clearing his throat. His voice, though calm, carried a weight that cut through the noise. "With all due respect, ma'am," he said firmly, "your behavior is out of line. This pilot has done nothing to deserve your disrespect." The blonde woman whipped her head around, her eyes narrowing as she took in the man's composed demeanor. "Excuse me? I have every right to express my concerns," she snapped, her tone defensive but faltering. The man didn't flinch. "You have the right to your opinion, but not at the expense of everyone else's dignity and peace. If you don't trust the pilot, perhaps you should reconsider being on this flight." A ripple of agreement swept through the cabin. Heads nodded, and a few murmurs of "he's right" could be heard. The blonde woman's bravado wavered for a split second before she straightened her shoulders, clearly unprepared to back down. From across the aisle, a young woman with headphones draped around her neck stood as well. Her hands were clenched into fists at her sides, and her voice, though quiet, carried an undeniable edge of anger. "It's 2025. How can you even think this way? Do you know how ridiculous you sound right now?" The blonde woman turned to her, her face flushing with a mix of frustration and embarrassment. "I'm not here to argue with children," she said dismissively. The young woman's lips curled into a thin smile. "Good, because you'd lose," she shot back. More passengers began to stir. A middle-aged woman in a floral scarf leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "My husband's a pilot," she said, addressing no one in particular but loud enough for everyone to hear. "I can tell you that what matters is skill, training, and professionalism. Skin color has nothing to do with it. This man's qualified, and that's all you should care about." The support for the pilot grew like a wave, passengers standing or leaning into the aisle, each adding their voice to the chorus of disapproval. A man holding a toddler on his hip shook his head and said loudly, "If you're not comfortable, ma'am, the door's still open." The blonde woman looked around, her confidence visibly crumbling as the realization set in: she was utterly alone in her prejudice. Yet, even in the face of overwhelming opposition, she clung to her stance, her words coming slower, her tone less assured. I just think safety should come first," she muttered, but her voice no longer carried the sharp edge of conviction. Someone in the back called out, "Safety isn't the issue, and you know it." A smattering of applause followed, brief but powerful, echoing through the cabin. For the first time, the blonde woman seemed unsure of what to do. She glanced around the cabin, her eyes darting from one disapproving face to another. The passengers' united front had cornered her, leaving her with no escape from the scrutiny. Her earlier bravado now looked more like desperation, and the weight of her words hung heavily in the air. Though no one spoke directly to the pilot, still unseen in the cockpit, it was clear that the passengers were not only defending him but also sending a message. This was not just about one man's qualifications or one woman's prejudice. It was about standing up for fairness, for dignity, for what was right. In the face of such solidarity, even the blonde woman's most forceful arguments seemed to crumble. And yet, as the tension eased slightly with the passengers' show of support, the blonde woman remained defiant, refusing to sit, refusing to admit fault. She was, for the moment, still a part of the flight. But the tide had turned, and the atmosphere in the cabin was no longer hers to control. The tension in the cabin lingered as the blonde woman sat quietly, her earlier bravado diminished under the weight of the passengers' silent support. Sensing the need to bring calm and closure to the situation, a senior flight attendant stepped forward. Her professional demeanor was as steady as ever, but her voice carried a note of gravity as she addressed the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience during this unexpected situation," she began, her gaze sweeping over the passengers. "I feel it's important to share something about the man leading this flight today. Our captain, whom you are trusting with your journey, is not just an exceptional pilot, he's an exceptional human being." The passengers, now silent and attentive, leaned in as she continued. "Captain James has faced challenges that many of us cannot begin to imagine. From his earliest days, he had a dream of flying. Growing up in a small community where opportunities were limited, he often heard people say, 'A boy like you doesn't belong in the sky.'" Her voice caught slightly, but she pressed on. "But he never let those words define him." The murmurs in the cabin grew softer, replaced by a collective sense of curiosity and respect. Even those who had been passive observers of the earlier confrontation now listened intently, their attention fully captured. Captain James worked tirelessly to prove them wrong. He studied late into the night, working part-time jobs to pay for his flight lessons. At every turn, he faced barriers that others never had to consider, questions about his abilities, his worth, his right to be in the cockpit. But through it all, he persevered. The passengers exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from curiosity to admiration. The gravity of her words began to sink in. This wasn't just about a man flying a plane, it was about a life spent overcoming systemic challenges to achieve a dream. Even after earning his pilot's license, she continued, he encountered prejudice in the industry, doubts cast not on his skills, but on his appearance. Yet every obstacle only strengthened his resolve. Today, Captain James holds one of the highest safety records in the airline, with over 15 years of experience. He's trained countless young pilots, inspiring them to reach heights they never thought possible. Her voice grew softer, almost reverent, as she added, "He isn't just flying this plane. He's carrying the weight of every barrier he's broken, every bias he's disproven, and every person who said he couldn't." A wave of emotion swept through the cabin. Some passengers nodded quietly, while others wiped away discreet tears. The weight of the pilot's story was undeniable, a testament to resilience and determination that transcended the conflict they had just witnessed. In her seat, the blonde woman shifted uncomfortably, her earlier indignation now replaced by visible unease. The story had stripped her complaint of any legitimacy, laying bare the pettiness of her actions against the monumental efforts of the man she had sought to undermine. The flight attendant's final words were met with a smattering of applause that quickly grew into a crescendo. Passengers clapped, not just for the pilot, but for the principles of fairness, respect, and perseverance that his story embodied. In that moment, the cabin felt united, the earlier division replaced by a shared sense of admiration for a man who had risen above so much to be where he was today. As the applause faded, the flight attendant smiled. "We are proud to have Captain James leading this flight, and we are grateful for your understanding and support. Now, let's continue preparing for takeoff." With those words, the cabin settled into a calm quiet, but the atmosphere was entirely different. The passengers' solidarity had grown stronger, and the story of Captain James had become a symbol of triumph over adversity. The blonde woman remained silent, her gaze fixed on the seat in front of her. For the first time, she seemed to realize that her prejudice had no place here, in the sky or anywhere else. The blonde woman sat stiffly in her seat, her fingers tapping in erratic rhythm against the armrest. Her earlier confidence had started to waver under the weight of the passengers' collective disapproval, but she wasn't ready to concede. Instead, she looked around the cabin, scanning the faces of those nearby. Surely, someone here would understand her perspective, someone who would agree with her concerns. All she needed was one ally. Leaning slightly toward the elderly couple seated across the aisle, she forced a polite smile and spoke in a low voice, as if trying to create a sense of camaraderie. "I mean, you must see where I'm coming from, don't you?" she began. "It's not about prejudice, it's about safety. Don't you think they should tell us things like this up front?" The elderly man adjusted his glasses, his expression unreadable. His wife, however, didn't hesitate. She turned to the blonde woman, her voice calm but firm. "I don't see where you're coming from," she said flatly. "A pilot's skin color has nothing to do with their ability to fly a plane. Frankly, I'm embarrassed for you." The blonde woman's smile faltered, her cheeks flushing with frustration. She shifted her attention to a younger man seated behind her, who had been silently observing the scene. "You seem like a reasonable person," she said, her tone almost pleading now. "Don't you think this is a conversation worth having? We're talking about lives here." The man raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his seat. "Lives?" "Yeah, including the pilot's," he replied. "A guy who probably worked harder than most of us to get here, only to deal with people like you questioning him for no reason. So, no, I don't think this is a conversation worth having." Her mouth opened as if to respond, but no words came. The sharpness in his tone left her momentarily stunned. She glanced at the row across from her, where a mother was quietly soothing her young child. The blonde woman hesitated before addressing her, softening her voice. "As a parent, don't you think it's fair to ask questions? To make sure we're all safe?" The mother turned her head slowly, her gaze steady and unwavering. "As a parent," she said, her voice calm but with an edge, "I teach my child to judge people by their actions, not their appearance. Maybe you should think about doing the same." The response was like a final blow. The blonde woman sank back into her seat, her earlier bravado now replaced with visible discomfort. She glanced around the cabin again, but the looks she received weren't welcoming. Some were openly disapproving, others simply indifferent, as though she had already become irrelevant to the larger group. The unified support for the pilot had left no room for her arguments to take root. For a moment, she fidgeted with the edge of her purse, her fingers trembling slightly. She muttered something under her breath, but it was drowned out by the quiet hum of the cabin. No one was listening anymore. Her attempts to rally support had not only failed but had further isolated her, leaving her alone with the weight of her own prejudice. As she stared at the seat back in front of her, avoiding the glances of those nearby, a sinking realization began to settle in. The cabin wasn't just indifferent to her complaints, it had rejected them entirely. The passengers' solidarity with the pilot, their firm stance against her perspective, had created an environment where her words carried no power. She was no longer the center of attention but a fading memory in the midst of a flight that was moving forward without her. The cabin, once tense with the blonde woman's disruptive demands, began to settle into a quieter, more reflective hum. Passengers exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from irritation to contemplation. The woman's outburst had ignited something deeper, a collective awareness of the prejudice she had so openly displayed. Conversation started in hushed tones, growing louder as more people joined in, sharing their thoughts and experiences. Near the front of the plane, a young woman turned to her seatmate, an older man in a neatly pressed suit. "Can you believe that? In this day and age," she said, her voice tinged with disbelief. The man nodded solemnly. "Unfortunately, I can. It's not the first time I've seen someone judged unfairly like that. You'd think we'd have moved past this by now, but here we are." A few rows back, a mother quietly explained the situation to her curious daughter, her voice calm but firm. "Sometimes people make assumptions about others based on things that don't matter, like the color of their skin," she said. "It's not right, and it's up to us to treat everyone with respect." The child nodded solemnly, her young mind processing the lesson. She glanced toward the cockpit door, a newfound admiration in her eyes for the unseen pilot who had become the subject of such an unjust tirade. As the conversation spread, passengers began to share their own stories, moments when they or someone they knew had been underestimated, excluded, or judged unfairly. A middle-aged man recounted how his sister, one of the few women in her engineering program, had faced constant skepticism about her abilities despite her top grades. "She had to work twice as hard just to be seen as equal," he said, his tone laced with frustration. Another passenger, a young black man sitting near the aisle, spoke up about his experiences. "I can't tell you how many times people have doubted me before even knowing what I'm capable of," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "It's exhausting, always having to prove yourself to people who've already decided you're not good enough." These stories rippled through the cabin, weaving a shared narrative of struggle and resilience. The atmosphere shifted, the tension replaced by a sense of unity and understanding. People who had entered the plane as strangers now found themselves connected by a common realization: prejudice wasn't just an isolated incident, it was a systemic issue that touched countless lives. The blonde woman, sitting silently in her seat, couldn't ignore the growing murmur around her. She stared straight ahead, her jaw tight, as if trying to block out the voices. But the weight of the passengers' discussions seemed to press down on her, a mirror held up to the ugliness of her own actions. One passenger, a woman with kind eyes and a calm demeanor, spoke with quiet conviction. "What that pilot has achieved is remarkable," she said. "And the fact that anyone would try to diminish that because of something as trivial as his skin color is just heartbreaking." Several people nodded in agreement, their faces reflecting a mix of frustration and resolve. The conversation wasn't just about the pilot anymore, it was about the broader implications of what they had witnessed. How many talented individuals had been held back or undervalued because of biases like the one they'd just seen? How many opportunities had been lost to prejudice? A man near the back of the plane, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke up. "You know what gets me," he said, his voice carrying over the quiet chatter. "It's not just about calling out people like her. It's about changing the way we think as a whole. That pilot deserves to be judged by his skills, not his skin color. And we owe it to ourselves, and each other, to make sure that happens." The cabin fell into a thoughtful silence for a moment, the gravity of his words sinking in. The passengers had started the flight as individuals, each focused on their own lives and destinations. But now, they felt a sense of collective responsibility, a shared understanding that they were part of something bigger. In that moment, the atmosphere on the plane transformed. The blonde woman's prejudice had initially cast a shadow over the journey, but the unity and determination of the passengers had turned it into something powerful, a lesson in the importance of fairness, respect, and standing up for what was right. The cabin grew still as the cockpit door opened. All eyes turned toward the man stepping out, a tall, composed figure in a crisp pilot's uniform. The captain's calm presence commanded the room without a single word. His polished black shoes clicked softly against the aisle floor as he made his way toward the center of the cabin, his expression neither defensive nor confrontational. He radiated professionalism, a quiet authority that silenced even the faintest murmur. For a moment, the passengers seemed to hold their breath, as if waiting for him to confirm or deny the unspoken questions lingering in the air. The blonde woman, who had been slouched in her seat, visibly stiffened. She avoided his gaze, her earlier confidence replaced by a strained silence. The pilot stopped in the aisle, his hands clasped lightly in front of him. His deep, steady voice carried effortlessly through the cabin as he began to speak. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Captain James Carter, and I have the honor of flying you to your destination today." His words were simple, but his tone was powerful, each syllable measured, calm, and filled with unwavering self-assurance. He allowed the silence that followed to settle briefly before continuing. "I understand there has been some concern raised about my qualifications to command this flight," he said, his gaze sweeping the room with a blend of warmth and seriousness. "Let me assure you, I am here because I have earned this position. I have thousands of hours of flight experience, rigorous training, and the complete trust of this airline to safely bring you to your destination." The passengers, many of whom had already shown their support, now sat enraptured. Even those who had remained quiet earlier leaned forward in their seats, drawn in by the pilot's presence. He exuded a quiet strength, a dignity that made it impossible to question his words. "Flying has been my passion since I was a child," he continued, his voice steady. "It's a passion that I have pursued with dedication and persistence, even when faced with challenges that had nothing to do with my ability to fly. My job is to ensure your safety and comfort, and that is what I will do." As he spoke, the mood in the cabin shifted further. The passengers weren't just listening, they were absorbing every word, feeling the weight of his story and the grace with which he handled the situation. The blonde woman's earlier outburst now seemed even more trivial, her words dwarfed by the captain's poise. The pilot paused, his gaze briefly landing on the blonde woman. He didn't single her out or speak directly to her, but the message in his calm eyes was unmistakable. Then he addressed the cabin as a whole. "In this profession, as in life, it's not about where you come from or how you look. It's about what you bring to the table, your skills, your dedication, and your integrity. I hope my presence here reassures you that you are in capable hands." A ripple of applause began near the back of the plane, growing louder and spreading quickly through the cabin. Passengers clapped, some cheering softly, their faces reflecting admiration and gratitude. The tension that had filled the air earlier was replaced with a palpable sense of unity and respect. The pilot offered a modest nod in response to the applause before adding, "Now, if you'll excuse me, I'll return to the cockpit to ensure we have a safe and smooth flight. Thank you for your trust." As he turned and walked back to the cockpit, the applause followed him, a collective acknowledgement of his strength and professionalism. The door clicked shut behind him, but the impact of his words lingered. Passengers exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of pride and reflection. The blonde woman, meanwhile, sat rigidly in her seat, her face pale, her earlier confidence entirely eroded. Whatever she had planned to say next remained unspoken. The captain's appearance had not only changed the mood, it had solidified a shared understanding among the passengers. His words had transcended the moment, becoming a powerful reminder of what truly matters, not the prejudices we hold but the character, skill, and humanity that define us. As the plane touched down smoothly, the cabin erupted into a round of applause, a tradition on many flights, but today, it felt different. The clapping wasn't just for the successful landing, it was a tribute to the pilot who had handled the situation with grace and strength. The passengers, still buzzing from the events of the flight, exchanged nods and smiles as they began gathering their belongings. The tension from earlier had dissipated, replaced by a quiet sense of unity. For many, this wasn't just another flight. It had become a moment they would carry with them, a story they would retell to friends and family, not for the drama of the blonde woman's outburst, but for the way the passengers had come together to reject her prejudice and support the pilot. Conversations that had started in hushed whispers during the flight continued as people stood in the aisle, waiting to disembark. Strangers shared their thoughts, reflecting on how easy it is to stay silent in the face of injustice and how important it is to speak up. "I never realized how powerful it can be to just show support," one passenger said to another. "Even a small gesture can make such a big difference." The other nodded. "It's a lesson for all of us. If we don't challenge attitudes like hers, they'll just keep going unchecked." The blonde woman, now subdued and visibly uncomfortable, sat quietly in her seat, waiting until most of the passengers had left before she finally stood. She avoided eye contact, her earlier arrogance completely gone. While her actions had sparked outrage, they had also created an opportunity for those on board to reflect on the deeper issues of prejudice and the harm it causes, not just to individuals but to society as a whole. As passengers stepped off the plane and into the bustling terminal, the pilot's words continued to resonate. His calm yet powerful response had left an indelible mark. Many walked away with a newfound respect for the resilience required to succeed in the face of bias and an awareness of their own role in combating such attitudes. For the pilot, the flight was just another day of doing his job, something he had dedicated his life to mastering. But for the passengers, it was a reminder of the strength it takes to rise above ignorance and hate, and how unity can triumph over division. This story is more than a moment on a plane, it's a call to action for all of us. It asks us to examine our own biases, to stand up when we see injustice, and to believe in the power of unity and kindness. What do you think about this story? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful and inspiring stories like this one. Together, we can create a world where prejudice has no place.